everyone. This is the Buttercup podcast where we talk about early childhood topics. And my name is Marisa Macy, and I'm the host of the Buttercup podcast. I'm so excited today because I have Dr. Brian Boyd. Dr. Boyd is the William C. Friday Distinguished Professor in Education, and he's also the director of the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. A special educator by training, Dr. Boyd's research focuses on the development and implementation of evidence-based practices that bridge school, home, and community contexts. His scholarship also includes a significant focus on the development of rigorous outcome measures for autistic children, ensuring that progress can be accurately captured across diverse settings. Dr. Boyd's recent work addresses critical gaps in equity, specifically examining risk and cultural resilience for Black autistic children and their families. He currently serves as president of the International Society for Autism Research. His research program has been continuously funded by federal agencies such as the National Institute of Health and the Institute of Education Sciences. He also serves on multiple scientific advisory boards dedicated to improving outcomes for historically underserved and under-researched communities. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Boyd.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yes, me too.
Mm.
Well, could you tell us how you got started in the field?
Oh, wow. It's a good sort of first question. Sort of a little bit serendipity. I was an undergrad in college, not quite sure what I wanted to do, although I did know I wanted to go to grad school eventually. Um, And I had read in my psychology course, I was an undergrad psychology major, about autism. And at the time, this was years, decades ago, autism was only a paragraph in a chapter on sort of abnormal childhood conditions. But something about that paragraph stood out to me. So I searched online. I can't remember how we searched back then because Google didn't exist, but however, we were searching online in those days. I searched online for autism, and what came up, probably because I was an undergrad in the state of Virginia, was a summer camp in North Carolina called the Autism Society, that was operated by the Autism Society of North Carolina, called Camp Royal. And I applied online to work at that summer camp. And to my knowledge, it was my first interaction and experiences with autistic individuals. And so I worked for 10 weeks. It was very intense. We had a different camper each week across varying age levels, from children to adults, varying levels of ability. So it was a very intense experience. It was one of those experiences where by the end of those 10 weeks, you either decided I'm going to work with autistic people for the rest of my life, or I'll never do this again. It was that intense. And I was one of those people who said, I want to do this for the rest of my life. And so from there, I ended up sort of applying for and working at the Teach Autism program in the state of North Carolina, which is a statewide program for autistic people. So really just an odd sort of experience where I was an undergrad trying to figure out life, and this thing about autism came up on the computer, and I tried it and went for it, and it worked out for me.
Yes, that is so awesome. Well, a lot of my students will probably be able to identify with your journey because so many of us start off at summer camps. When I was I have a daughter and we're getting ready for her summer camps. And when I was little, I was part of a summer camp, and then when I got older, I worked in a summer camp. So that is so neat to hear your origin story and how a summer camp really changed your life.
Yeah.
And what a wonderful opportunity to begin your work. So when I was introducing you, one of the things in your bio is evidence-based practice.
Hmm.
And my students listen to this podcast. And could you tell us what that means, Dr. Boyd? What
Yeah.
are evidence-based practices?
Yeah, I think people should really think of it as a decision-making process. So, for one thing, this idea of evidence-based practice really comes out of healthcare, where it used to be called evidence-based medicine, and we've sort of adopted it in the within education. But it's really a decision-making process. It's how we use these various components. One, research evidence on various instructional strategies and practices to guide the work we do. But in addition to sort of using research evidence that's generated by folks like me and others, we also integrate sort of the values, the wishes, and preferences of children and families, but also the professional expertise and judgment of professionals. And all of those things, those three parts of what we call the evidence-based triangle, make up and inform our decision-making processes, or should make up and inform the decision-making processes of practitioners in deciding what will work for a particular child that's sitting in front of them, right? So when you have that student showing up to your classroom and you're not sure what to do with them, using that combination of research, of your own professional wisdom, of understanding their values, their interests, and talking to families and putting that all together to inform decision making. So really think of it as a decision-making framework or tool that can be used to sort of guide practice.
That's a great way to think about it as a decision-making tool or framework to guide practice. Could you talk a little bit more about the triangle idea?
Yeah, just the triangle idea really is there are, as I said, three parts to this decision-making process. And the research evidence is only one part of it. I think it's the part that gets talked about the most, and it is an important part, but it's one third of that triangle. And so we can't ignore sort of professionals' expertise and judgment because practitioners are bringing their own experience to the situation when they're working with young children with disabilities. And so you can't throw that out. And we also can't throw out, and it's important to understand what are the priorities of the family and what are their preferences in sort of thinking about what interventions may work for their kids. Families have often tried things at home as well, and they probably have an idea of what things work for their child versus don't. Families have the best knowledge of their children, so we don't want to ignore that knowledge. And I think increasingly, we also don't want to ignore the preferences of the child themselves. How do they feel about the things we're doing with them? Are we asking them if they like those things? And so using all of those things to sort of individualize practice. It's really to help us sort of individualize and personalize the instruction that we're providing to children to help them learn and grow.
That is great. Thank you for that perspective. Uh, and you talked about the triangle, and research is one component of it. And you're at a university. In fact, you're in the research triangle
Yeah.
in Chapel Hill, where you guys are an academic powerhouse community with so many high quality, amazing universities in such a small area. Um, and you're at a university, I'm at a university, and we can easily access our university libraries to
Yeah.
find research. We can go into the archives and find digital archives or actual stacks and touch like a real journal article, uh, and find research. And
Mhm.
we're trained, you and I have been trained how to do research um, in order to locate evidence-based practices. But how would a professional working in early childhood settings who might not have access to a library like us, um, how do they find evidence-based practices? How do they know if what they're doing has research behind it to support it? I'm thinking, a lot of um general educators and special educators uh, might have limited training. They might even be on an emergency teaching license where they haven't gone through a teacher prep program, but maybe they were trained in another field and they're coming back to the profession, or they're coming to the profession. And so they haven't had coursework, uh, maybe like someone else who's been trained at a university. Could you help us with that, Dr. Boyd?
No, it's such a great question. I'm nodding because I'm in such agreement. And I think the question also brings up this whole idea that we also talk about in the field of what's called an implementation gap. So there's this huge gap in when research evidence is generated by us academics and universities and when it actually shows up and is fully implemented in practice. And some people say it takes 17 years for something to go from being research generated, so studied and shown to be evidence-based, and actually seen, it implemented to scale and practice in some way. So we have what is called this implementation gap. And part of the reason we have that implementation gap is exactly what you're talking about, because it's difficult for practitioners to get access to the research information. It's even difficult for us as researchers to keep up with the volume of research that's happening right now. So how do we expect practitioners to do that? Then there's not an easy answer, I think, to some degree. I would say if people are part of professional societies like the Division of Early Childhood, sometimes you have access to more practitioner-oriented journals where you can use that. I would say listening to podcasts and engaging social media in some way where people like yourself are trying to put the work out and the research out in different ways that may be more accessible and may be more amenable to the time demands of practitioners because they also don't have time to sit down and read journal articles. They need to sort of interact with the material in a different way. So the more we can engage social media. I think the other thing that's happening now is people are using AI and other kinds of tools online to search for, evidence-based practices. Now, I don't know, I think we always have to be careful around what people are finding online because it's an artifact of how good the data within the internet and that ecosystem exists to really know if it's really informed by evidence or not. But that's just to say that practitioners are searching for things online, certainly, as one resource. I will say, just as a specific idea or way that practitioners can get access to this information, there are groups like, including the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, where I'm the director, where we have online free modules for practitioners that introduce them to evidence-based practices. And these were ones specifically developed for students with autism, but they're accessible modules that are free for practitioners to sort of view and engage to learn how to implement a practice. And they were really designed to help bridge that research to practice gaps. And we're not the only group. There are other sort of online resources like that where there's sort of visual content to help support the learning for practitioners. But I think this is a huge issue that we need to be working on a lot more around how do we get the research evidence being generated more quickly into the hands of practitioners.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I love what you said about the implementation gap and how it can take many, many years to get research into the get research to translate research into practice where
Yeah.
people are actually using it and uh, making it part of their services and practices that they provide for their students and their children that they're working with. Uh, and then you also mentioned about access and resources that our most precious resource is time, and teachers and professionals, uh, they're busy enough with providing direct services, and they might not have time to go and do research. And so just having the time is such an important thing. Well, and there used to be a lot of people using What Works Clearinghouse and other research tools, and I'm not sure if that's if you're noticing that, especially in your area.
Yeah, I think people do try to find sort of organizations that have already synthesized the research on particular topics in one way, and what Works Clearinghouse is an example of that. It still is sort of having to spend time reading through and synthesizing and understanding that work in some way. So I do think if we can provide some kind of supports to practitioners that provide visuals or brief videos or things or other ways for them to engage and learn the material, it's also going to be helpful to supplement some of those resources that exist. They're also that because what you just said reminds me the U.S. Department of Education also sometimes puts out sort of practice guides, sort of where they synthesize the information, research information in a way that's really written and geared to practitioners. So what do we know about early reading for young children, and how do we do that in practice? So I will look for some of those resources through the U.S. Department of Education as well. They put out a series of practice guides on various topics that are really written for practitioners.
Great, excellent. And you mentioned Division for Early Childhood, and we have two great journals as part of our organization, the
Mhm.
Journal of Early Intervention, uh, which is very research oriented.
Yeah.
And then we have a more practitioner oriented where it translates research to practice, and that's
Yeah.
Young Exceptional Children. And those two uh, journals would be really helpful too. And that's wonderful too about the Frank Porter Graham modules because I think a lot of us now consume information in different ways, and being able to use media in ways where we can get information for our jobs is great too.
Absolutely.
Well, could you share a little bit about your research agenda and what's
Mhm.
exciting to you today with your research and
Yeah, I'm one of those people. I feel like I've done lots of different things. So as you stated in your intro, a big part of my work is focused on sort of understanding evidence-based practices because I'm a special educator by training, a sort of former teacher. Um, and so that's been a big part of my research agenda is really sort of developing and evaluating evidence-based practices to specifically support young autistic learners in schools. So that's been a big part of it. I think my research has evolved based on problems of practice. So what am I hearing from teachers? What am I hearing from families that are really shaping their experiences? And I think a lot of what I've become, sort of excited about is sort of the under-researched groups where we don't have as much research or don't have as much evidence. And so sometimes those are kids with more challenging forms of autism. So kids with sort of more severe co-occurring intellectual disability. Those kids have actually historically been excluded from a lot of studies. And so there's a group where we're missing research. Some of that has focused on sort of racially or culturally minoritized families where we don't have as much research. And so understanding their experiences and do we need different practices for those groups of families? How do we adapt the current practices we have? And so sort of research along those lines. So really understanding where is it that we still need research? What groups haven't been included in research? I think the other thing that is really shaping my research and that I've gotten really excited about recently is just more in community engaged research. So a lot of my research we're more directly partnering with either families of autistic individuals or autistic individuals themselves to shape the research agenda. So, what are their priorities? What do they think us academics and researchers should be studying or learning to improve their lives? So, really, sort of this community partnered research and co-designing research studies has really excited me and reinvigorated me because I think it's the teacher in me. I've always just been formed by practice. And so it's another way to have my research really be informed by practice. So those are the kinds of things that excite me these days.
that is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I think a lot of us have that same process where uh, it's a problem that either we've experienced or the families that we work with have experienced, or uh, uh, people in the workforce that are sharing with us, and we want to try to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And one way to do that is through research and meaningful research that could inform policy. And I love that. So your research agenda has been shaped by personal experiences and also problems of practice.
Yeah,
And when we
absolutely.
read a journal article, that's one of my favorite things to read is what's the problem? And sometimes the problem is not so clear,
Yeah,
or sometimes the problem is very complicated, or
yeah,
and it's just really neat to see how a journal article really unpacks and clearly defines the problem statement. And our research questions come out of that. I'm really geeking out now, but I'm so excited to talk to you, Dr. Boyd, about research and all of the cool things that you're doing. And when you were talking about identifying a research agenda and how your own research agenda has been shaped, it just made me think back a long time ago. One of my professors, Dr. Edward Kamanui, was the director of the Office of Special Education Programs. And I remember going to Washington, D.C. one time, and it was one of his first meetings, and he was sharing with all of us in the audience this matrix that he made because uh, I took some of his classes, and he was just such a brilliant professor, and I learned so much from him. But when he took over that job for OSAP, it was such a huge job because it
Mhm.
was not just his research agenda, but it was for the nation,
Yeah, yeah,
America, not
yeah.
just like a little thing. And so he used a systematic process where he had this matrix that he shared with all of us. And in the matrix, it was showing almost kind of like a frequency count, like how much research we have in these different
Mm.
categories and where there's gaps. And so part of his vision came from those gaps, like what you were
Yeah.
talking about with implementation gaps and research gaps. And I just think we can do that on a smaller scale with our own research agenda, but our research is so important, and it can make a huge difference for families and for our workforce. So thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think identifying those gaps, those places where we don't yet have research is really important for how we serve children and families. Because ultimately we want to be able to serve all children and families to the best of our ability. But when we're missing important information on certain groups of children and families, that affects our ability to help them in practice. And so it is important to identify those gaps. And it helps us understand how to better individualize instruction, how to better meet the needs of children and families. It really does help us if we can figure out where those gaps are and where we still need research.
Yes. Yes. Well, getting back to evidence-based practice and children on the spectrum, um, what would be some examples of evidence-based practices that uh, professionals might be using or could use for children that might be on the spectrum?
Yeah, so I'm going to encourage students and others. They're called the Affirm modules. Um, Now I'm forgetting what Affirm totally stands for, but the A is autism. But you
People
could,
ask me
it's,
what Buttercup stands for. It's like, okay, it's a lot of words, but basically play.
I think they're autism focused intervention, but if you Google Affirm FPG UNC, you'll find that. I think that that group, through a systematic process, has identified about 28 evidence-based practices. And some of those are things that we know, like visual supports for young children, picture exchange communication system, some forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. So there are things that we're using in practice. I think one of the things it shows is that a lot of what people are using in practice indeed has some kind of evidence base for it. So parent implemented intervention. So supporting parents to implement sort of good practices and high quality practices with their children. So, one big category of practices that we have right now are called sort of naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. And those are interventions that are both based on sort of principles of developmental science. So, what practices that are developmentally appropriate for children and that hit important developmental targets. So, like working on children's communication skills, because that supports learning in other domains. But they're also informed by behavioral science. So the science of teaching intervention, right? And so that category of practice is one big category. That category of interventions is one big category where we have a lot of research evidence. And beyond autism, naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions are used with a variety of kids with different kinds of abilities. So, I think we do have some evidence-based practices. They are officially listed on the Affirm website, those specific to autism, but there's certainly other places. But again, those were informed by research evidence and sort of synthesizing the literature and figuring out what do we know from the literature that works. But again, for practitioners, it's then figuring out how do you implement that in practice and which ones make sense given your own background and training and sort of the priorities of the family that you're whose child you're working with, what makes sense for them. So integrating all that information, but at least gives you a starting place with some of the decision-making process a little bit.
Yes, that
Yep.
is awesome. Thank you. So affirm and if you type in affirm and then Frank Porter Graham or FPG.
Yeah.
So next week is an exciting time at Frank Porter Graham, and people all across the United States are coming to you in Chapel Hill. Could you share with us, Dr. Boyd, what is Frank Porter Graham and what is the
Oh.
Inclusion Institute?
Oh, good question. So yes, I am the director of a research center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill called the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. We are actually celebrating our 60th anniversary this year, so it has been in existence for
Yay!
60 years.
Congratulations!
Thank you. To some degree, Frank Porter Graham sort of came out. Well, it's named after someone who is very famous within the state of North Carolina. He was one of the first presidents of the UNC, and also at some point a state senator. But he really valued education and supporting education of young children. So that's the namesake. But the center really kind of spawned out of what was then sort of Lyndon Johnson's his efforts around the war on poverty. So how do we break sort of the cycles of poverty? And one of the ways that we think that happens is through providing good education, allowing people to get access to good education to improve their sort of their own economic circumstances. And the sort of the one of the seminal studies that what we call FPG for short, FPG is known for is called the Abecedarian study. And this was a study that started in the 1970s where young children between birth to age 5 were randomized to two conditions. They either receive, and these are kids in poverty, that's important part of the story. They were either randomized to receive high quality education offered through FPG, offered at FPG, or to get their services as usual. So community services as usual. And these folks have been followed now into their 40s, right? What if I can do math, or 50s almost. And what they have found is long-term benefits from receiving access to high quality early education. So better employment outcomes, better health outcomes because people who are employed get access to private insurance, better academic outcomes, also less contact with criminal justice system, all the things we want good education to provide. So that's one of the things we are very well known for that went on to inform a lot of policy decisions around the importance of high quality early childhood education. But as part of FPG, we have for the last 25 years, well, actually 26 years, last year, the Inclusion Institute celebrated its 25th anniversary, held an annual conference that's really about sort of inclusive education. And it brings together sort of researchers, policymakers, families, advocates, practitioners, all to learn and share information around how do we sort of go about the good work of doing high quality, important, inclusive education and learning for young children with disabilities. And so we are proud to continue to have that annual meeting. Lots of great folks come. It's actually international, and it's been
Yes, I didn't mean
international for
just
a while.
America.
Yeah, yeah.
It is
people
international.
from other countries attend who are interested in sharing their experiences around how inclusive education is going in their countries. And so there's an international exchange as well. So it's a great annual conference and it's happening next week and I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And I am so honored to be invited to come and talk about
Glad
authentic
you're coming.
assessment. And yeah, thank you. And I'll be talking about 1 week from today, authentic assessment and children who are multilingual learners and their
Oh,
families. So that'll
awesome.
be my topic, and I can't wait. It'll be my second time coming to the Institute, the Inclusion Institute, and it is such a wonderful place to come together with people all across the world
Yeah.
and talk about early childhood practices that support children's development and learning and their families.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Absolutely.
and thank you for telling us about Frank Porter Graham too, because and the research. When you were talking about the Abecedarian Project, one of my very first guests on this podcast, like over 10 years ago, was Dr. Craig Ramey. And
Oh, wow. Yeah.
he was the PI and
That's right.
co-PI. And one of the cool things he was talking about with evidence-based practices was how to design longitudinal research studies.
Mhm.
And he talked about things like attrition. And like you said, the children are adults now, maybe even
Adult.
grandparents,
Yeah.
maybe in
Possible.
their 50s.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of how old they might be now, but they continue to track the children and track their health. And one of the cool things I remember him telling us on the podcast was how he and his team uh, send personal greeting cards and when they have a birthday or celebration, holiday celebrations. And I just thought that is such a powerful tool because uh, they're not just numbers in a research study. I mean, these are people's lives, and to have a relationship like that with, over time, it's really helped them stay connected to the abecedarian and not lose people over time. But I,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think it's been a sort of a hallmark study, and so it certainly has led to some very important outcomes, and one we're super proud of, and FPG is part of our history. So.
yeah. Well, what innovations in research or practices excite you today?
Oh, that's a good question. Hmm. I mean, one of the things I've been doing, maybe I'll just share a little bit about a current study I've been doing. So again, special educators, so really have always focused on observable behavior and the things they can see. But we actually have a study where we're looking at language development of autistic toddlers who currently aren't speaking many words, but we're combining the behavioral data with actually looking at at sort of their activity of their brains using a method called EEG, where you put a little cap on the kids and you can measure their neural activity to understand the relationship between brain and behavior and how that predicts or leads to spoken language for kids or doesn't. So this whole integration now of sort of neuroscience and education and bridging those fields and thinking about how those things relate, because as educators, we all know that, hopefully what we're doing is having an impact on children's sort of learning, and that we know that impact is happening, within the brain, that we're affecting and shaping brain development because early experiences certainly shape brain development, but actually trying to study those things and bridge those worlds is very interesting and looking at some of those things. So it's one of those exciting projects that we're really interested in and can't wait to see what some of the studies. And we're actually doing this because things have become more advanced, like technology is becoming more advanced. There's actually a little machine that we take to families' homes. So we don't even have to have families come to us. We can do all of this in their homes. And we're collecting this sort of brain activity data. And the parents are actually pretty excited about it. They're like, "Oh, so cool. Like they're measuring my kid's brain. So it's not just the researchers who are excited, the families are also like very interested that we can do this within the context of their child's home. So I think that's one of just one of those projects that's sort of innovative and different and something outside of my usual comfort zone that's not just about evidence-based practice, but can be really informative to help us understand what leads some kids with autism to end up having words and some kids not end up having words. If we can understand what's happening at both the level of the brain and with behavior.
Very
So that's the
cool.
research. I would say the practice piece, it's not necessarily innovative, but when you're talking about the Inclusion Institute, I think, what I want us to continue to advocate for and practice and talk about and speak up about is the importance of inclusive education. Because we know from the research that it supports, if done well, it supports both children with disabilities and their typically developing peers benefit from interacting with and having experiences with children who have disabilities. So, I think just in practice, us continuing to really sound the importance of inclusive education and sort of early experiences with inclusion and how that really shapes sort of development for both groups over time is really important. So I just think that's a practical practice thing that we need to continue to do right now.
Absolutely, Dr. Boyd. Last year, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Public Law 94-142 and the
That's right.
Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Yeah.
And in 1975, when that law was passed, it was huge. I
Yeah.
mean, getting a law passed to support children with disabilities and giving uh, legal right to an education is so important. Children have a right to have an education and to uh, that was such landmark legislation in 1975. And I think uh, what uh, what we have seen over the decades, 50 years, is we were fighting so hard to get access in 1975 that access to inclusive settings and access to inclusive curriculum and interventions and instructional practices that support all children and specially designed instruction for children who have goals and objectives for a highly qualified professional to serve children who have those needs and have uh, the access. But over time, now we have access. It's no longer a fight, but now we have to advocate for high quality. It's
Yeah.
a paradigm shift. We need to have trained professionals who know how to support inclusion, who know what to do with all the children, and who know how to use evidence-based practices fluently and proficiently, and be able to use data to make decisions and make data-driven decisions based on what they're learning and what they're seeing. And so I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. We're all seeing this. There's a growing number of children and adults who are neurodivergent in some way, ADHD, anxiety, autism, so more of these kids are showing up in classrooms. And so again, as you're saying, we need to support teachers in providing high quality inclusive education for those students because we're just seeing more neurodivergent kids show up in various ways. And so we want to make sure that they have the best outcomes and they are supported and can be fully integrated into schools. So,
Yes, and the right to an education, a
yeah,
high quality education, and supporting and advocating for inclusion. And um, it's such an important thing. And uh, children miss out if we don't do what's right. And for example, if a child uh, is sent home an hour early because of busing and transportation, that's an hour early every day. That's 5 hours a week. And you multiply that by
Yeah.
months and years, and that's a denial of their right to an education. I mean, that's
Mhm.
just so simple. And in
Yeah.
1975, when that law was passed, uh, we know that all children have a right to get an education, and
Absolutely.
this focus on quality now and using
Hmm.
practices that have been researched and have good outcomes. And yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I just
I'm
got so
glad we're
excited.
no, no, and I'm glad that we've been able to shift the conversation, as you're saying, because of the law, from access to how do we make sure that they're getting high quality experiences and outcomes. I think, when we think about sort of issues of inequity, they really show up in three ways: access, experiences, so the kinds of experiences children are not having in schools, and then inequity and outcomes. So are we seeing different outcomes for certain groups of students and individuals? And so we've gotten access with kids with disabilities for the most part. Now we need to focus on their experiences to make sure they're high quality, and the outcomes to make sure those are good and positive for kids. And so I think we can still work on those things. Yeah.
Yes, yes, that might be the next 50 years.
Yes, yes.
Hopefully it won't take
Well,
that long.
yeah. So maybe we can speed things up. AI
Yeah.
will solve it, I'm sure. AI will solve it.
Well, Dr. Boyd, how can people follow you?
Oh my gosh. I am not a huge social media person. So I would say follow Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. We're on the various social media channels. I have a LinkedIn page so people can connect with me via LinkedIn if they want. So I'm sure if you just look up Brian Boyd LinkedIn, you could probably find me. But other than that, I'm not a social media person. So that's the one place where I don't spend a lot of time.
Yes. Well, and P.S., don't forget to follow Dr. Boyd's research. And you can follow his research in academic journals. And where are some places you like to publish?
Oh gosh, where are some places I like to publish? Certainly the early intervention journals you mentioned, so Journal of Early Intervention. I published in some of the autism specific journals like Autism Research or Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorder. So that's where I publish some of my work. I'm out on the road. I'm giving various talks at different places too to share my findings and hopefully keep the community informed to the best of my ability around sort of what's happening, at least within the behavioral intervention education side of the autism research landscape. So try to do a little bit of that and doing things like this, like talking to great people like you on podcasts. Is another way I get to get out there and share what's happening and what I'm doing a little bit. So I think those are some of the ways I try to disseminate my work. I think increasingly, though, as I was saying, back to the community engaged aspect is sort of thinking about co-presenting sort of with members of the community in different ways. And so that's another part of sort of what I've been doing and the work I've been trying to do. So, because I think the community is also the best at helping to disseminate the work we're being generated because they know how to talk to their community members in ways that make the research we do understandable and meaningful to them. So.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
You too. Have a great day.